China had come to a very dangerous belief that they had a right to challenge the decisions of the government. Reporters were demanding the right to tell the truth and to report truthfully on the news. What was next? Freedom? Democracy? Workers and peasants demanding their rights? The possibilities were horrifying. Deng, Yang, and Li Peng felt the people of China needed to be taught a painful lesson, to fear their leaders and to obey. Senior leader Deng Xiaoping was chairman of the military commission and the most powerful man in China. Around May 8th, he began meeting with China's top generals to drum up support for martial law and a military attack on the students and their supporters. To his dismay, Deng discovered that many generals and commanders were not willing to use the People's Liberation Army to attack the Chinese people. The students were also expressing their dismay at the unwillingness of the government to open a dialogue or to retract the April 26 editorial which labeled them terrorists and counter-revolutionaries. As Deng met with his military commanders to plot strategy to use force, the students came up with their own strategy to force the government to take their demands seriously. Student leaders felt they needed to do something dramatic. Some students proposed setting themselves on fire. Instead, they would stage a hunger strike. The concern with food was a central part of Chinese daily life. Tens of millions of Chinese had starved to death during Mao's Great Leap Forward, and food rationing was still part of normal Chinese life. Chinese often greeted each other by asking, "Have you eaten yet?" The hunger strike announced on May 12th captured the attention of the entire nation. Initially, 500 students pledged to take part, donning headbands, identifying them as hunger strikers, some even tying cloth over their mouths to symbolize their refusal to eat. Within days, the hunger strikers numbered in the thousands. Students began to chant, "If we do not speak, who will speak? If we do not act, who will act? If we do not struggle, who will struggle? If we do not fight, who will fight? Our country, our society." Others shouted slogans, "I need food, but I'd rather die without democracy." Compared with people from the West, Chinese people are not as well fed and are quite thin by comparison. Lacking sufficient body fat, students started fainting from hunger the very first day, and the drama of the starving students as they were taken away by ambulance was broadcast live on TV. All across China, the plight of the hunger strikers captured the attention of the young and the old, professionals and peasants, students and workers. People worried about the plight of the students who were willing to starve to death because they so loved their country and their cause. The hunger strike was a brilliant stroke, and they had planned the hunger strike perfectly. Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union and a champion of freedom, of glasnost, who was a hero to much of the Western world, was scheduled to visit China in 2 days, and all the world's press would be in Beijing and Tiananmen Square to cover the momentous occasion. Now, thanks to the hunger strikers, the focus of the world will be on the student democracy movement. On Monday, May 15th, the government ordered that Tiananmen Square be cleared as it was to be the official site for the welcoming ceremony for Gorbachev. Instead, the people of Beijing again defied the government, and over 150,000 people crowded the square in support of the students and democracy. Across China, men, women, children, and the aged watched and worried over the health of the students, fearing they would die. The communist leadership was receiving reports of demonstrations in every province in over 145 major Chinese cities in support of the students. The people of China were turning against the government and siding with the students and their demands for free speech, a free press, and democracy. Many reformers were worried. Fearing the government would crush the democracy movement, reformers and renowned intellectuals journeyed to Tiananmen Square, making speeches urging the demonstrators to clear a path for Gorbachev. Some of the student leaders also felt they should clear the square as a sign of their patriotism and love of country. However, most of the students and their supporters felt that the government must first make some concession or agree to meet. Otherwise, to abandon the square and the hunger fast would be viewed as a major defeat. Gorbachev was forced to enter and exit the Great Hall of the People through a side entrance. Li Peng and the right wing of the Communist Party feared and resented everything that Gorbachev stood for. By contrast, Zhao embraced Gorbachev's views on openness, freedom, and democracy. Deng was wary of Gorbachev and his policies, and in fact lectured and warned Gorbachev about the dangers of political and social reform. The people should have the freedom to make money, but not the freedom to challenge or even question the policies of the government. Outside the Great Hall of the People, students and their supporters were calling for the resignation of Peng, Deng, Yang, and other right-wing leaders, demanding that they step down from power. What they hoped is that the conservatives would resign, leaving Zhao and the reformers in power. Zhao and Gorbachev had a lot in common and a lot to talk about. Both were advocates of freedom of speech, openness, accountability, and other democratic principles. Zhao had a long history of championing reform and freedom. During the 1987 Party Congress, Zhao Ziyang was finally able to get the principles of dialogue to become official policy. But he made many enemies who distrusted the concept of openness and who did not trust Zhao or the Chinese people. It was during Zhao's meeting with Gorbachev that Zhao admitted that Deng was in fact in charge of the country and had the final say over all decisions. He explained that Deng, although an advocate of economic reform, was not willing to make social or political reforms and wanted to use the military to crush the democracy movement. Deng was furious at Zhao for letting Gorbachev and the world know that Deng was the man in charge. Deng was even more furious with the students and the people of Beijing. Deng was the supreme leader of China. His meeting with Gorbachev, the supreme leader of the Soviet Union, was to be a grand diplomatic achievement. Instead, the students had embarrassed him and his government on international TV. Deng began to hunger for revenge. The students had made him look foolish, and Zhao made him look inept. Indeed, Deng could not control the people of China, and he could not even control the food in his own mouth. Across Beijing, over 1 million people from every imaginable occupation and age group were now cheering on the students and joining in the democracy movement. Workers, doctors, lawyers, and reporters from every newspaper, all demanding democracy, freedom of speech, and the end to corruption. Hundreds of thousands of people across China were now supporting the students, with protests and demonstrations breaking out at dozens of cities and universities. Everyone wanted to join in. They wanted to be part of history, and people brought their husbands, wives, children, and their parents, all chanting and singing and shouting slogans demanding freedom and democracy. Although the students were not calling for a revolution, revolution was taking place. Suddenly newspapers were reporting the truth, and the people were giving voice to long simmering complaints. Suddenly it seemed safe to voice opinions, to disagree with the dictators, to call for change and the end of oppression, and everybody wanted to join in. Fasting students were also starting to drop with alarming frequency, many driven away by ambulance to be treated at local hospitals. Organizers held up placards showing the number of students who had fallen. Over 342 students had collapsed. They were fainting at the rate of 1 every 6 minutes. After meeting with Gorbachev, Zhao Ziyang stood on the roof of the Great Hall of the People and stared with amazement at the hundreds of thousands of people massed below. What he also saw were banners demanding democracy, freedom of speech, the end of corruption, and asking, "Where is China's Gorbachev?" Knowing they had the support of millions of Chinese, the leaders of the democracy movement were now demanding meetings with Li Peng on live TV. There was a growing rift within the Communist Party, and a growing power struggle between the reformers led by Zhao Ziyang and the right-wing reactionaries led by Deng and Li Peng. Zhao and the reformers realized that all might be lost if the students did not agree to end the hunger strike and to call off the protests and demonstrations and return to class. Reformers were facing an impossible situation. If they couldn't get the students to leave Tiananmen Square and to end the demonstrations, the right-wingers would win. Zhao, hoping to convince the students to end their demonstrations, sent a message commending them for their patriotism and acknowledging their demands for greater democracy and promising that Deng's editorial would be rescinded. Zhao Ziyang also sent a representative who promised the students that the Central Committee of the Communist Party would view the demonstrations as patriotic and no one would be persecuted if they agreed to end the strike and the demonstrations. Instead, the students and their leaders, believing they had the support of millions of Chinese, increased their demands for dialogue. By May 18th, with a million people in the streets, Peng and the conservative right-wing leadership felt they had no choice but to meet with the student leaders. When Li met with the student leaders in the Great Hall of the People, in an event that was televised across China, he had only one goal in mind: convincing the students to stop their fasting and to leave the square. In response, the student leaders, feeling perhaps overconfident, informed Li that it was up to the student leaders to decide what questions should be discussed. Li and the other right-wing leaders were angered and felt insulted by the student leaders, who Li called rude and impolite. The student leaders responded with arrogant contempt, reminding Li that the students had the backing of 1 million people. Li was warned that his government could be overthrown and replaced if it failed to represent the Chinese people. The meeting solved nothing other than to harden the resolve of Li, Deng, and Yang to use military force. On Friday morning, Zhao Ziyang made a last desperate attempt to save the democracy movement in his own position as General Secretary of the Communist Party. He made his way to Tiananmen Square, talking and shaking hands with students, and then boarded a bus containing hunger strikers. Zhao realized the end was near. His eyes were filled with tears. He took a megaphone and pleaded with the students to end the hunger strike and the demonstrations. He said, "We deserve your criticism. We are not here to ask for your forgiveness. We all want our country to become better. But it was impossible," he said, "to solve every problem in an instant. You are young and you should live to see the realization of your dreams for a new and modern China. The channels for dialogue are wide open." But he warned, if you insist on immediate change, on immediate answers, if the demonstrations do not end now, it will soon be too late and all will be lost. According to transcripts, Yang, Peng, and other top leaders met with Deng that evening, where they discussed the threats to their power posed by the democracy movement and the specter of another cultural revolution which had removed many of them from power in the 1960s and 70s. According to transcripts, and I quote, "We have 1 million people in the streets. We can't let this descend into rampant lawlessness like the Cultural Revolution. Didn't we get enough of that the first time around? Do we really want it to happen again? The 1 million-person demonstrations are even bigger than the Red Guard rallies during the Cultural Revolution. Without martial law, we are saying we accept indefinite anarchy. These people are asking for it. The PLA must go in and carry them out on their backs. Give them no mercy." The specter of the Cultural Revolution, the specter of a people rising up against their corrupt leaders, frightened them all. Deng knew firsthand the dangers of cultural revolution. He had been viciously attacked as a capitalist roader who was enriching himself and his family. He had been purged twice from positions of leadership, and his mentor, President Liu, had been imprisoned, tortured, and murdered. President Yang had also fallen victim to the Cultural Revolution. Like Deng, he and his family were accused of taking the capitalist road and enriching themselves. He had been beaten and paraded through the streets and removed from power. Both Deng and Yang had learned from history. Both knew their hold on power could be taken away by the students with the backing of the Chinese people. It was the Cultural Revolution all over again, with the exception that students were demanding freedom and democracy, whereas in the Cultural Revolution they supported Mao's madness and a cruel dictatorship which crushed the people and their hopes. Deng felt personally threatened. He knew there were more and more demonstrations every day throughout China, demonstrations which could remove him from power, like the Cultural Revolution. Student protests and demands for democracy had erupted in over 116 cities, with demonstrators numbering more than 10,000 in Shanghai, Tianjin, Harbin, Changchun, and on and on and on. Deng felt that the PLA should attack the students in Beijing and elsewhere in the country to suppress the turmoil once and for all. The student democracy movement would be suppressed, and all those who had supported them would be punished, including Zhao Ziyang, who soon would be placed under arrest. For the leaders of China, power is maintained not through democracy or the will of the people, but through bullets and guns. Power in politics is all about force, and force is the only reliable way to maintain their monopoly on power. Deng had given Li the authority to crush the democracy movement. That evening, Li Peng spoke to the nation and declared martial law. The leaders of China would use force to terrorize the people into submission and to maintain their power. The student democracy movement would be put down by force. Li Peng also used the loudspeaker system of Tiananmen Square to announce martial law and warning of resolute and forceful measures to curb the turmoil and restore order. It was a declaration of war. He was calling in the army to crush the student movement. On May 20th, the People's Liberation Army was authorized to clear the streets. Upon hearing the news, students began to shout, "Li Peng stepped down," and "Long live Zhao Ziyang." The following day, the hunger strike would end, but as Zhao had warned, it was too late. Students and the citizens of Beijing reacted to Li Peng's martial law declaration with a mixture of fear, shock, terror, disbelief, and rage. "Hooligan government," they began to shout. "Kill Li Peng. We will fight to the end." Slogans and posters began appearing opposing martial law. Students and citizens were chanting, "Down with Li Peng, down with Yang, down with Deng." The last time the People's Liberation Army entered Beijing was in 1949 and was welcomed by the people as liberators. There was a saying in China, "The army was fish, the people like water. The army cannot live without water." That evening, tanks and trucks filled with soldiers began to rumble towards Beijing. Over 22 divisions from 13 PLA armies were sent to enforce martial law. To the astonishment of the dictators of China, over 1 million people took to the streets, setting up roadblocks and barriers, including buses, sewer pipes, and bike racks. In many parts of the city, there were barriers at every intersection. All over the city, hundreds of military trucks were blocked by students, men, women, children, and the aged. The troops were stuck in a sea of people. Parents carrying children on their shoulders stood in front of the convoys, blocking the way. Soldiers were offered tea and cigarettes. They were told that the students were good and patriotic, that the students loved China, and it was the patriotic duty of the soldiers to support them, to support the people. Children, students, and old women pleaded with soldiers not to attack the city. Children pleaded, handed them copies of the People's Daily and the Beijing Daily, which had written articles supporting the students. Soldiers were surprised, even shocked. They had been forbidden to read newspapers, watch TV, or listen to the radio, and they had been told nothing about the demonstrations or the reasons they had been sent to Beijing. Over 1 million people were guarding the streets, and over 100 top army commanders refused to attack unless they received orders in writing from Deng Xiaoping. The people won, and the convoys turned away and left Beijing. Deng was so humiliated, angered, and frightened that he ordered 2 of the top military generals to pay personal visits to every top commander. They were warned, next time, they and their soldiers should obey their orders, or they would be shot. 1 million people marched the next day, calling on Li, Yang, and Deng to resign. At least 319 different schools and universities were represented. And millions had come forward not because of what this or that leader had said, but because they yearned for freedom and democracy and the end of corruption. Students would leave Tiananmen Square only to be replaced by new enthusiastic students from other provinces who were not yet ready to give up. As some students left